Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation after what I'm going to talk to you about now. And I really want to talk about this idea of building back better. It's a term you've probably heard a lot of people talk about here in the UK. Boris Johnson is using that phrase. You've probably heard that it was one of Joe Biden's big campaign messages. But in fact, it has humanitarian roots. And as far as I can tell, I think one of the first times it really came into use was after the 2004 Asian tsunami, the Boxing Day tsunami. Of course, you'll probably remember so much devastation to so many communities across Southeast Asia. And humanitarian workers, emergency response workers, the communities themselves started to talk about the need to build back better, and to the extent that Bill Clinton, who was a humanitarian envoy, coined the term, and it came into popular parlance in the humanitarian community. This idea that these communities, their physical infrastructure and so on, needed to be built back better than what they had prior to that tsunami. And sadly, I think those humanitarian roots are all too appropriate when we talk about building our economies back better after the COVID-19 pandemic, because there are so many examples of why the economy that societies around the world were dealing with, were influenced by, had going into COVID wasn't good enough. And in fact, it was doing so much damage. And there are all sorts of figures that I could share with you. But in fact, I just want to start by sharing a poem. And this is extracts, just extracts only. So I encourage you to dig out the fuller version. But this is a poem from the Dalai Lama, rather appropriately called The Paradox of Our Age. And he really wrote saying, look at this paradox that we've got all these conveniences, all these modern conveniences, but we've got less time. These are times of fast food, but slow digestion, more degrees, levels of education have gone up in higher education particularly, but less sense. And he also said, we've got more computers to hold so many copies than we've ever had before. We've got, and he might have added also all that instant communication of social media, but we have less real communication. And he summarizes by saying these are times of tall men, but short characters, steep profits, but shallow relationships. And I want to reflect on how that might translate to the role of the economy. And at the very end, I'm going to talk about the role of artists and creatives in helping us turn our attention to truly building back better. So where we are today, or particularly going into COVID, is what I summarize as the long road option of our political social settlements. And this essentially has been an agenda where the first step has been essentially the mantra of grow the economy bigger, but almost turn a blind eye to the collateral damage that does to people and to planet. And then the next step is do your best as politicians to sequester some of that back via taxes. And of course, you'll be so familiar with how difficult that is with high levels of tax evasion and avoidance and all the political maneuvering that requires. But eventually sequester some back through taxes and then use that to help people and planet deal with the collateral damage of step one, helping them cope and survive with the damage that a growth-orientated, a growth-dependent, and an economy designed for growth does to people and planet. And I can give you a few examples of that. Firstly, step one is ignoring the mounting science that our planet cannot handle an enormous, infinitely growing economy. There is so much science out there, and this idea that we can maybe just decouple the impact on the planet, particularly through carbon, from a growing economy is showing that it's not happening fast enough, it's not happening globally enough, and it's often done through some trickery of accounting. But and it is just looking at carbon. There are so many other dimensions of the environmental crisis that we need to attend to. But it also ignores the reality of diminishing marginal returns. And this is a term that economists are quite familiar with. Essentially, you get less bang for your buck the more you have of something. And I can illustrate it here with this idea of salt. We all need a bit of salt in our diet. A little bit of it makes our food better. But you get diminishing marginal returns the more and more salt you put on your food. So the same it is with economic growth. Countries that do not have enough to meet their citizens' basic needs, whether that's a country or even a community. There are certainly parts of Scotland here where I live that need more to increase basic material needs. In those circumstances, when growth is used well, when it's used to direct it to those people who need it most, when it's pro-poor, when it's invested in our collective institutions, our health systems, our education systems, then growth does do a good job, because it yields all sorts of returns in terms of various aspects of social progress, whether that's increased life expectancy, reduction in poverty, increased literacy rates, increased health, and so on and so on. And I could show you some charts. Maybe we could come back to that in the discussion. I've tried to keep this fairly chart-free today. But the same it is with the economy. You get to a point where the benefits of more and more growth start to tail off. And then, in fact, maybe even diminishing marginal returns is almost a benign way of looking at it, because actually what we get to is a terrain where we're having to get some money to deal with and repair some of that damage. And this has been described as failure demand in social policy terms. An example here of just how much money our societies spend on security, defensive industries, but the security, the guard labour economy, because we're scared of each other. And that's got its roots in inequality. But there are so many other examples of this, whether it's top-up wages because people are still working for their poverty, whether it's housing benefit because of a dysfunctional housing market, because of whether it's a lot of treatments for anxiety and depression because people feel they don't have control over their lives, and so on and so on. And you'll all, when you look at the newspapers, you'll start to see examples of this, that if we took these intermediary, these downstream remedial defensive reactions, and also if you think about it in an environmental sense, there's so many examples of the cost of responding to environmental breakdown, cleaning up after an oil spill, rebuilding buildings after a devastating hurricane or tsunami or bushfire. There are so many examples of this. And if you really start to look, why are we having to spend money on this? Because of the damage that's been done. And if you ask why, you find yourself looking at how the economy is structured. So there's a lot of that money that is justified because we need to attend to the damage of a growth-orientated economy on people and planet. And so now is the time, I think, to have these words of William Beveridge. And he's a chap who was writing in the midst of the Second World War, the document that laid the foundations for the UK's very world famous National Health Service and our social security system here in the UK. And he wrote on the front pages of that report that a revolutionary moment in world's history, of which we today are certainly in the midst of as we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, that he says a revolutionary moment is a time for revolutions, not just for patching and repairing and being responding to the damage with sticking plaster interventions, calling ourselves heroes when we slightly reduce the gap between rich and poorest, rather than asking, why did that gap open up so much in the first place? And I think when we're thinking about the economy and thinking about truly building back better, we need to have the words of William Beveridge ringing in our ears, thinking about it's a time for revolutions, not for patching. And so then when we think about what might a better economy look like, this is what so many people are starting to now describe as a well-being economy. And the simplest way I can describe that is an economy that is designed to deliver social justice on a healthy planet. And these are some beautiful words written by a colleague of mine who does an amazing work creating a wellbeing economy in her part of Glasgow. She says, what does it really mean? Well, it's when you're able to develop assets that meet the real needs of your community. And she had this lovely story where she talks about it's a single mum who came up to her organisation and said, can I have some space so that I can support families and young people who are dealing with addictions and mental health issues? And why that's a good example for Kirsty is, as she says, a wellbeing economy is about equality, it's about respect, it's about empowerment, it's about ownership, and it's about trust. So how do we go about building that sort of economy? Well, essentially to recognise that it is born of and united by our common values and fundamental human needs. And I could give you examples that come from literature on international development, literature from religions, even popular songs, masses of artistic examples. I could even give you evidence that comes from psychology or sociology or even neuroscience, where scientists track what our brains light up when we're in relationships, it's when we're in nature, and it's when we're in cooperating. All those sorts of evidence come together to give us a core sense of what it is that makes us innately human. And at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, we asked our members and said, what is it that's your ultimate dream for how the economy needs to operate? And we distilled them down into what we describe as the 5 WEAll needs that our economies need to be orientated to deliver, rather than being orientated to deliver faster economic growth. And so these are things like fairness, tending to injustices, reducing that gap between rich and poor, but in horizontal injustices as well. So reducing injustice around gender and race and so on. It's about restoring and regenerating the natural world. It's about ensuring that participation happens so that citizens are engaged in their communities, as Kirsty Flanagan was describing, locally rooted economies. This is about also dignity, ensuring that everyone has enough to live on in comfort and safety, to have health and a healthy life expectancy. And it's also about connections. It's about ensuring that people have a sense of belonging and that those institutions are orientated in a way that serve the common good rather than acting for those who are at the top of the economic pile and where they can play the rules of the game to benefit themselves. And so how do we go about building an economy that's in service of these needs, that serves humanity rather than the other way around as we've had for the last few decades? Well, it's a complicated story, and I want to give you a sense of that by just sharing with you this idea of the multi-level systems that we have to grapple with. So at the top there, you have what's described by Frank Gills. This is a simplified version of his amazing thinking. The landscape level. And this is about how we do talk about the purpose of the economy, state of the environment, what's happening with technology. Underneath that, you have the policy regime, almost like the mese level, where the landscape is the macro level. So the mese level, this is the terrain of politicians. This is regulations, subsidies, incentives, encouragements, laws, legislation, those sorts of things that are influenced by our understanding of how the economy operates, but also will influence and constrain and create the enabling context for the micro level. These are the individual initiatives, projects, business activities, and so on. And the thing with economic transformation is that we need action at all levels of that system. So this is a hell of a job that we need to embark on. And fortunately, there are people who are rolling up their sleeves and attending to all those different levels of the system. But the key thing is how they interact and constrain and inspire each other across those levels of the system. And so when we're thinking about how do we start to build that economic system that's a well-being economy, that's orientated for social justice on a healthy planet, I've started to think about the key 4 Ps. These are purpose, prevention, pre-distribution, and making sure it's people-powered. And I'll take you through those briefly now. So firstly, about purpose. This is about understanding that we should no longer be the ever-faithful followers of economic growth. This is designing our economy for faster growth in terms of GDP. And you'll hear that when politicians and the media talk about economic recovery. They are largely thinking about what's happening to gross domestic product. And yet, as I've discussed earlier, we know that it has run its course in so many countries and it's not being used as a strategy to serve higher order goals. So what we need to do is flip that on its head and say, let's be fair weather friends of growth. When it's useful, in what circumstances, when it goes to those who need it most, okay, let's have it. But let's not be its ever faithful followers. Growth of the economy should not be an objective in and of itself. And so what we need to do is understand the difference between the means and the ends. Growth as a strategy to higher order goals of social justice on a healthy planet. And practically, when we're thinking about GDP, that then means we need to think not just about the rate of GDP growth and perhaps even downplay that, but think about the direction and the composition of that growth. In fact, is GDP being driven by more spending on failure demand and defensive expenditure? Or is it going up because of good things are happening in society? Or even perhaps, is it going down because we're having to spend less on security because people are feeling safe in their communities? Is it going down because we're having to spend less on diabetes drugs, or spend less on Prozac and antidepressants because people are feeling healthy in their communities? So we need to put aside the straitjacket that GDP and a growth-orientated economy takes us into and be much more nuanced when we think about the role of economic growth and the place of GDP in measuring our economies. So that's purpose. And then prevention. This is about taking the time to look upstream, to look at the circumstances in which individuals live their lives, not being content just to respond to their immediate symptoms and treat and heal and repair, vital though that is, because we need to help people survive today and tomorrow. But we cannot constrain ourselves there, because that is a humanitarian intervention on the face of an inhumane economic system. So what we need to do as societies is say, yes, we need to help people survive and cope today and tomorrow, but we also need to look upstream and understand what are the root causes of so much of that damage. Why, prior to COVID, was life expectancy flatlining in some parts of the UK? Why was in-work poverty going up? Why were food bank use going up? Why were levels of stress and anxiety and loneliness going up? And keep asking why until there is no longer a why to ask, and pay our attention there in terms of our intervention, and not just be constrained to helping people survive and cope. We need to be bolder and more ambitious than that. And that's what Beveridge is telling us. Don't just patch, have a revolution. And then in terms of practically translating that to the economy, this is this idea of pre-distribution. And essentially it's a rather clunky term, but it essentially is about saying, how can the economy do more of the heavy lifting in terms of generating more equal outcomes from the beginning, rather than the state having to step in with redistribution through taxing and spending? So how can we get more ambitious with our economy playing its role in delivering social justice on a healthy planet? And the sorts of things this conversation takes us into is questions of ownership. Who owns wealth? Who owns assets? What are the design of our businesses? Do we have worker cooperatives where workers own the capital themselves? Are we using procurement pipelines to direct them to the sort of activities we need and the sorts of firms we need? Are we harnessing public spending to make sure it stays locally, rather than being extracted off to remote firms? This idea of community wealth building, bottom-up economies, harnessing local economic multipliers. Do our prices reflect the true costs of inputs to them, whether it's an environmental input or whether it's a social input? So much of the core economy, the care economy that happens in our homes, so often by women, is ignored in the cost of production. So our prices need to be more accurate, so we have a real understanding of the true cost of goods and services. They're the sort of questions, and I would say that this is not necessarily about spending money anymore. This is about a question around the design of the economy. And that's one of the hallmarks of thinking about a well-being economy, as opposed to perhaps that 20th century idea of social democracy, that long road that I talked about before, where we just treat and repair rather than being more ambitious with how the economy operates. So that's pre-distribution. So we've got purpose, prevention, pre-distribution. And then the final P is people powered. This is ensuring that people are at the forefront of economic decision making, whether it's through economic democracy, whether it's through citizens' assemblies, whether it's through a richer array of democratic processes, participatory budgeting, and so on, but essentially helping people feel in control of the economy rather than at its beck and call. And essentially, this is born of the faith. And really the knowledge of experience too, that when people do collaborate and work together, they can achieve quite extraordinary things. And there's lots of an agenda around this. This isn't some new idea that people have been talking about, because in fact, there are very long roots of this agenda of thinking about what's the very purpose of the economy, how can it be redesigned in a way that serves people and planet. So 1968, some of you may have heard it. If you haven't listened to it, look it up on YouTube, where Robert Kennedy, when he was running for president, did the most poetic tirade against GDP, where he says it measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. Just a couple of years later, the children's book, The Lorax by Dr. Seuss, was published. And if any of you have read it to your children, you'll know it's a real warning about constant growth and greed. That same year, we had the Limits to Growth report. And again, very busy at the beginning of the 70s. I had the King of Bhutan declaring that gross national happiness was more important than GDP. Skip forward a few years, and of course I'm skipping forward lots of action. There's this very selective list. Then we had the global financial crisis, and some people thought this might be the wake-up call. This might be the moment that we restructure our economies. But it didn't happen that way. But what did happen is a year later, you had a landmark report in the Beyond GDP movement, commissioned by President Sarkozy of France with Amartya Sen, Jean-Paul Fitoussi, and Joseph Stiglitz and others, that really pushed forward the agenda of thinking about how can we have measures that are better aligned with what we people and planet really need, rather than just narrowly focusing and being ever faithful followers of GDP and economic growth. A few years later, you had the UN report on a new development paradigm that was convened by Costa Rica and Bhutan, really saying we need to focus on a different way of doing progress. A few years later, the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed, and they set out a really beautiful roadmap of 17 goals that are not orientated on their own at GDP. There's a bit of growth in there, so there's a bit of criticism there, but the SDGs are a different vision, and they're with that beautiful undercurrent of leave no one behind. They paint a different picture of how we should be doing the economy. And then we had the update from Sarkozy on the Commission of the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress. That same year, in 2018, my organisation, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and also WEAll, the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership, which is governments coming together to share ideas and practice to how to put wellbeing at the heart of economic policy making. Of course, you had the beginning of Fridays for the Futures, led by Greta, with young people coming out of their schools and standing up for their futures. And then the next year, you had all sorts of initiatives with academics calling on the European Union to dethrone King GDP and crown Queen Wellbeing instead of a growth and stability pact, having a sustainability and wellbeing pact. You had New Zealand launching its first wellbeing budget. And when Finland held the European presidency, they were really pushing this agenda of the economy of wellbeing. And then, of course, COVID hit. And I will confess to you that I thought this agenda is going to be stopped in its tracks, as governments will think now is the time to not focus on any long-term thinking and just go very narrow on with sustaining the economy or paying people's wages through furlough and so on to get out of this pandemic. But as ever, I was delighted to be wrong, because this conversation has only got louder and louder as that idea of build back better, as we're now hearing, shows. And so some of the landmark reports that really push this agenda along in the last 18 months or so are things like the UN Human Development Report, where the chief of the UN, Akam Steiner, is saying, yes, humans have developed amazing things, but we have done so by taking the earth to the brink, things like climate change and inequality. And he says in these red words here on the slide, these are the results of societies that value what they measure instead of measuring what they value. We also had the UK government, the Treasury of the UK government, commissioning Professor Dasgupta to do a review of the economics of biodiversity. And he warns on focusing too much on GDP. He says it means we focus on immediate consumption and immediate investment, and we don't pay enough attention to the biosphere. We then had Hawaii with its feminist economic recovery package as it responds to COVID. These, again, are just some examples. You had the President of Ireland, Michael Higgins, saying we need to pay attention to this alternative paradigm that's gaining acceptance, and these powerful words as the only real alternative to the continuation of yawning inequalities and ecological devastation. Of course, then Ireland, as a coalition government, last year and early this year then brought in a framework to think about well-being. And they, of course, are joined just recently by Canada. And in fact, over half OECD countries, Italy, where many of you are based, have well-being frameworks, multi-dimensional well-being frameworks. And that work by governments to better measure well-being is married by people around the world knowing that things need to change. And these are figures just prior to COVID, people believing prior to COVID that their lives won't be better off in 5 years' time. Over half people around the world thinking capitalism is doing more harm than good. This growing sense of inequity, unfairness, thinking that the institutions, our governance systems, serve the interest of the many, not the few. And this was research that came out during COVID. This is UK figures showing that people say we want the government after the pandemic to prioritise health and well-being as opposed to economic growth, mirrored by many, of which these are just a small example, similar findings in global surveys. This is one by Globescan during last year, saying, again, a majority saying they want to see a restructuring of the economy, revolution perhaps almost if they're listening to Beveridge, that addresses things like climate change and inequality, rather than simply going back to normal. So this is, again, the roots and the momentum behind that Build Back Better agenda. And I want to now just, as I finish, think about the role of art in being part of that economic transformation movement. Artists have to be at the forefront of it, because there's so many different tasks that are needed. I showed you that multi-dimensional systems perspective with all the different layers that change needs to happen. And we need artists to convene people, to help us understand different ideas, to be the visionary, to help us invest and double down on good things that are happening, to excite people, to energize people, to navigate inside and outside of current systems, and then push from the outside to help us be more creative with how we evaluate things, but particularly help us imagine things differently. Because I often get asked, what is the biggest barrier to this agenda? And I think actually it's our collective imaginations being too limited to imagine an economy that's better than growth. And back in 1983, President Ronald Reagan of the US said, there are no limits to economic growth because there are no limits to human intelligence, imagination, and wonder. Well, I think today it is our limited collective imagination that is keeping us stuck with those old recipes of the past, which have shown that themselves to be inadequate. They're not up to dealing with creating the economy that serves people and planet. So what we need is artists at the forefront of helping us not just imagine a better future, but do so better by being inspired by what is already happening around the world. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for having me.